My power stance would be this.
All right, let's do this thing. I am here with a man named Raphael Rowe. And first of all, it's good to see you, man. It's good to be having this conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me on, Ben. I feel from the moment we started speaking that you have such a calming voice that it's already relaxed me. Not that I'm not the type of guy that gets relaxed, but you have such a relaxing voice, and that's reassuring, I'm sure, for all of your guests. But thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, man. I appreciate the compliment. And you have similar vibes in your voice. There's a calm, cool, and collectedness to you. And that makes sense knowing where you've been in your life. And this show that I got into last year, The World's Toughest Prisons on Netflix, that you're the host of, you go into some really scary places and you go through the process that the prisoners go through in these prisons. You have to stay cool because you're in there with the population. And I must say, the way you handle yourself in such an environment is impressive. So that's an overarching theme that I want to talk about on this show today is prison, the prison system, what works, what doesn't work, and how do we heal? How do we care for and treat our criminals, our mentally ill, our addicted populations? What is the best case scenario? Because I think you've seen in your travels, you've seen the best and the worst. So maybe we could start though with your story and how you ended up being involved in prison.
Well, for those who don't know my backstory or anything about me, my journey obviously started, or one element of my journey started when I was 20 years old. And that was that I was arrested by the police here in the United Kingdom alongside a number of other individual men and young men, and I was charged and tried at a court for a series of robberies and a murder that I did not commit. And so I was convicted by a jury of those crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. I then spent the next 12 years of my life from the age of 20 until the age of 32. So the next 12 years in prison fighting against my wrongful conviction. So my experience of prison was in those 12 years. And I must say that, from the age of 20 to the age of 32, I was a very volatile young man because I didn't accept what was happening to me because I did not commit the crime. The system had got it wrong. The jury had got it wrong. The police knew that they got it wrong. Witnesses given false evidence. And so for those 12 years in prison, it was a very tough, both physically and psychologically, because I went through many different challenges in that time to survive. And alongside that, campaigning with the power of the pen and the paper to try and get my convictions overturned. So that's where my journey begins and ends, in the prison. I spent 12 years in prison for a murder and a series of robberies that I did not commit.
So I think most people are probably asking the question, how does this happen? How does this happen in recent history, where there's, from a layman perspective, I'm like, there's cameras everywhere, there's DNA evidence, like it should be relatively easy to convict the right person for a crime, especially when you're talking about murder. And, how does this happen? And, I'm assuming that you were in a phase of your, like, when I was in that phase of my life, I was getting into a lot of trouble and I was hanging out with troublemakers. Doesn't make you guilty of the crime, but was it this combination of like you having certain associations with people who, were doing crime and bad evidence gathering, or was it a conspiracy against you? Did the local police just want to take you down because they didn't like you? Like, how does this happen?
I think it's easy to try and excuse why a person like myself spent 12 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. And it's easy to blame the police. It's easy to blame the system. I would argue that I wasn't fitted up for a crime I didn't commit. I was fitted into a crime that I didn't commit. And by that, I mean, as you say, as a young man, I had my brushes with the law. You know, I was a happy go lucky, petty criminal, living the life, parties, girls, drugs, doing the things that teenagers who are not focused on university often get distracted by: the good life, the fun, the things that make them happy as opposed to academia or education. And so I was caught up in a culture where you did become the attention of the police. And to put this into context, this didn't happen at a time where social media existed. This didn't happen at a time where we had the internet. I was
Mm,
arrested back in 1988, over 30 years ago.
mhm,
And there was here in the United Kingdom, and especially in the inner city, council estates, marginalized communities, you know, a focus on black communities. There was a focus on racism. There was a law unto themselves by the police. Again, that's not me saying that everybody who comes from those communities or has a color to their skin or come from a particular ethnic group are targeted by the police. What happened in my case was that when the police arrested me and a number of other people, there were individuals who became witnesses who were prepared to say things that just were not true. And I'll give you an example. The victims in my case described the perpetrators. Three men were involved in the murder. Three men were involved in the series of robberies. The victims of these crimes described the perpetrators of consisting of two white men and one black man. I was convicted alongside two black men. At the time that I was arrested, I sported dreadlocks. I have brown skin. I have brown eyes. The victims also described one of the white perpetrators as having fair hair and blue eyes. Now, I don't fit that description. None of my co defendants, one who also had dreadlocks and brown eyes and darker skin than me, didn't fit that description. And the third man, who was also black, didn't fit that description. So that's just giving you a flavor of what we were up against. The police were still focused on ensuring that three young black men were convicted because it was easy to say they're bad, they're monsters, they are
mm,
criminal anyway, than to pursue the real perpetrators. So not only were we, um, targeted, but the victims of the crimes didn't get justice themselves. So this was all in the context where here in the United Kingdom, there was an issue around racism. The National Front was prominent. There were calls for the criminals to be, you know, punished in a way that allowed the police to become a law unto themselves. And like anywhere in the world, the police are often believed by the public. If they say they got the right people, then people tend to believe that the police got the right people, even where there is no forensic evidence. Because in my case, there was no forensic evidence or DNA evidence because we didn't commit the crime.
mhm.
And so I was fitted up and into the crime because witnesses gave false information, false evidence to the prosecution at the time of my trial. And the victims' descriptions of the perpetrators were ignored. The evidence that pointed towards those that were guilty was ignored. And then there was one crucial element to my case beyond the identification, beyond the fact that I had a cast iron alibi that was overlooked again by the jury and the prosecution. And it was that the police withheld crucial evidence in my case at the time of the trial that was not uncovered until 12 years into my life prison sentence. And that evidence was considered by the European Court of Human Rights, and a unanimous decision of 21 European judges declared the right that I was denied the right to a fair trial. That led to my case going back to the Court of Appeal, my conviction being overturned, and me as a 32-year-old man who lost all of his 20s in prison being released.
Wow, man, what a story. I do understand this story because it's amazing to be talking to a person who has been through this, but I can't tell you how many stories I've read or how many movies I've seen where someone who was already agreed upon to be a bad guy based on the color of his skin gets plucked out of society and locked away. And the people are told, we got another bad guy. And they go, all right, good stuff, without, there's not much recourse there. And I think that's part of the problem with how policing and jailing is done in a lot of societies, where uh, for us, psychologically, for the citizens, we're like, oh, okay, the bad guys go over there. And, we think to ourselves like, oh, but what if some like not bad guys get caught in the mix, or non-guilty guys get caught in the mix? Well, but what if if they disappear, like, do I really notice them? And what if I already don't like them? Maybe I want them to be guilty, and off they can just go out of my way, And there's this, like, in a way, it feeds the collective shadow, right? The piece of our society that piece of ourselves that we don't want to face. We can just like embody that in another person and then lock it away, right? So, yeah, I really that sort of hit home as you were telling your story.
Do you know, Ben, it's deeper than that, on the level that, yeah, people are stereotyped, people are ostracized, people are othered by a system. But it's incredible that the law-abiding citizen who sits on the jury, the observers during a court case, hear the evidence, see the information, are those closest to the trial, my trial in particular, heard the victim stand in the witness box and give a description of the perpetrator consisting of the color that I explained earlier on. And
Mm-hmm.
yet the jury still were able to ignore that. Now, why is that? It's not because the jury were racist, although in my case I would argue there was an element of racism, because all of the jury members were white. And we were three black men sitting in the dock, two of us with dreadlocks, another black guy, and we were just portrayed as guilty people from the outset. But my point is this: it's the skill of the prosecution team, the skill of the police, that convince people that they are the people protecting us from bad guys. They are the people protecting us from criminals and crime. And if you want us to continue protecting you, you've got to believe in what we're doing. And so they are very skilled at convincing people, whether it's through the media or in a court case, that they are the good guys, and the people that they're pointing the finger at are the bad guys. And they just make things work. And that's an element of what happened in my case. And they got away with it by hiding information from the jury so that we could not present all of the evidence, even though the evidence we did present, or that was available to that court, was clear that we could not have been guilty of these crimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we give away our um, ability to read and understand nuance more and more. It seems like we're losing nuance more and more as time goes on here, even as we get more and more advanced as a society. And when you give that power away, you're giving it to people who get to say to you, hey, there's good guys in the world and there's bad guys in the world. And we're going to tell you who the bad guys are. And you're a good guy. And here's what you need to do to stop the bad guys. We're just going to tell you what it is. And we're going to get the nod from you. And then we're going to go do it. Right. And that's a very dangerous dynamic to be in, where the people have given away their power, or they're disempowered, or a combination of both. And you end up with more and more situations like this at the individual level, but also at the the population level. You get countries being attacked with this same logic. So how did you fight? Like, you were largely on your own in prison trying to fight your own sentence. How did this work?
When I first went to prison aged 20, I was in a prison within a prison. So not only was I in a maximum security prison, but I was held in a maximum security prison within a maximum security prison. And by that, I mean, when I was taken in at 20, I'd go through the general population of maximum security prisoners, and I'd be kept in and was kept in a smaller prison within the prison, a very secure prison. And in those first 18 months of being held on remand, waiting to go for trial, that's when I first started to see, because up until that point, I'd gone through interrogation by the police. I was accused by the police of being involved in these crimes. I openly told them everything I could possibly tell them, that I was not guilty. So I wasn't one of those who sat there saying no comment because I had something to hide.
Mm,
No, I was as verbal as I possibly could be. But it was during those months that I was being held on remand, awaiting to go to trial, that I was drip fed documentation that set out the case against me, but that also included documentation of witness statements. So that was when I first learned
right.
what colour the victims had described the perpetrators. That's when I learned that the murder was committed at a time that I had a cast iron alibi, and that those witnesses were being threatened and undermined by the police in various different ways. So my fight started when I was on remand, and I did all that I possibly could to understand the law. So in between the age of 20 and 21, in a cell on my own, banged up 23 hours a day, only allowed out of my cell for 1 hour every day. I had no toilet in the cell, no utilities, no facilities to wash or anything like that. I would use what we called a recess, the slop out area, where I'd take my potty out of my cell every day to empty my piss and poo. I would have to wash in the same basin that I emptied my piss and poo, as did a number of other high maximum security prisoners who shared that block. So the whole ordeal at that point was really psychologically challenging, but it gave me an inner strength that was born out of the anger of what was happening to me. Now, as a 20-year-old, I was a happy-go-lucky, but all of a sudden, overnight, I became this individual that was not accepting of what was happening to me. And reading those documents gave me a deeper hope that I built my anger on. And even after I was convicted and moved to other prisons throughout the country, I went to various different maximum security prisons here in the United Kingdom. I continued the same theme of reading every document, obtaining all the documents, discussing it with my lawyers. And there was no internet, there was no email, there was no digitization of anything. So for me, it was always a pen and a piece of paper. I think years after fighting the system physically, because I took my anger out on the prison staff, I took my anger out to some extent on myself. I almost self abused myself because, for example, when you're convicted, as I was after 18 months, the prison system expects you to behave in a certain way. They expect you to conform to the regimes. Now, I wouldn't work. I wouldn't go where they wanted me to go. I wouldn't do what they wanted me to do. And the consequence of that resistance was punishment. So I spent even more of those years in segregation and isolation. So despite the fact I was in a single cell on my own in all those years, sometimes over a period of years split into many months or weeks, I would be down in the, let's say, the cellar of the prison system, in a deeper hole by myself, but with my documentation. That's the one thing they couldn't take away from me most of the time. And that just allowed me to consume myself with my case. I studied the law, I studied journalism in order to fight my case, not to better myself, but in order to understand what was happening to me. I used what they did against me, i.e., the law, the criminal justice system. I used journalism to try and get my voice out of those deep, dark cell holes into the public's imagination. So, in the same way, the media, and it was a high profile case, So in the same way the media reported on my case, I used the media to get my voice out of the prison. So I would send letters, I would talk to journalists. And this all took a number of years. But in answer to your question, Ben, my fight started with anger. I was so angry about what they did to me. I couldn't let it go. And that drove me to fight my wrongful conviction.
Mm-hmm. Wow, man. Yeah. So much strength, so much resolve. And um, my next question is really, you know, was there a spiritual element for you at all when you were in prison? Um, did you develop a spiritual connection for yourself? I don't know if you're a religious man, but I, yeah, I know that a lot of people draw on that side of things when they're locked up 23 hours a day sometimes. Yeah. And yeah, so that's the question.
I I I'm not religious, never have been, never will be. I didn't believe in any higher being or lower being. I believed in myself. Where that came from, I don't know, but I believed in what I was doing. I believed that I was the only person that was going to get me out of that predicament. I couldn't believe in a God for the simple reason, how could somebody be so wicked to do something so wicked to me? If that
Mm-hmm.
person existed, why did they allow that to happen to me? In the same way, I would
Right.
question how that can happen to many other people, children, men, women all over the world. How can they be so tortured if there was a higher being? So no, it wasn't about religion, it wasn't about spirituality, although some people may describe that deep inner anger, that deep belief that I had in myself is a God, it is a spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
I don't and didn't see it like that. I saw it as the only strength I could draw on. Now, in those months and years that I was fighting my wrongful conviction, the only thing that I would do was keep myself physically fit. That was the only thing. I practiced yoga. I ran around the exercise yard whenever they would let me out. I played football. I did press ups and sit ups and all the kind of self exercises that you can do in a prison cell. I'd go to the gymnasium when I wasn't in the punishment block. So I kept myself physically strong in order to keep my mind strong, and that combination gave me the inner strength to withstand the years of suffering that I went through.
Mm. And I'm sure when COVID hit, you just adapted quickly and moved into body weight exercises and stayed fit.
It was an
So,
observational time for me. It was interesting because I think for me, this might not be the right thing to say, but there was a satisfaction in all the years trying to explain to people what it's like being confined in a cell where all your decisions are taken away from you. All of a sudden, people were getting a very small flavor of what that was like. You can't do what you want when you want because we're restricted. There's things. And so it was
yep.
quite satisfying to have conversations with people during the COVID period and still now where they kind of get it to some extent, and then if you magnify that 1,000 times, they really might understand what it's really like for anybody, not just me, but anybody being in prison.
100%. 100%. I mean, most people like their homes. They like being in their homes. It's a comfortable place. But the perspective and the experience of your home, all of us, it changed when we were basically told that we couldn't leave our homes or that we couldn't go there, we couldn't go there, we couldn't go there. We could maybe go outside around our home, but anywhere beyond that, like we were basically not allowed to go. It changes the whole thing. All of a sudden you're like, actually, like this, I'm not that comfortable here now. Even though all my stuff's here, my bed's here, my kitchen, I got my screens, I'm still uncomfortable. This feels really constricting. So now when moving into how I encountered you years later, you're on this show. You're the host of this show, The World's Toughest Prisons. And to be honest, I never thought I would be watching this show. There's a lot of prison shows on TV. Look how bad it is in prison, or look how yeah, look at all the security in these prisons. There's shows like that, And but whatever brought my wife and I to watch this show, I realized there was a depth to it and there was an exploration that you were going on here that was beyond looking for drama. You were really trying to look at the deeper layers of the system and what's working and what's not working, and what are the factors that influence the men behind the walls and the guards, and the process that a prisoner goes through as he moves through. How did you get on the show? Was this your idea? Did somebody approach you with this?
I should start by saying when my convictions were overturned, and I was released and I'm a free man, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. Yes, I studied journalism whilst I was in prison. I understood the law, but there was little for me to do when I got out of prison because I didn't have any skills. I had this insight, this ability, this experience, and it was just very fortunate that I met someone at the right time who offered me an opportunity to work for the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC. And so within a year of getting out of prison and shouting from the Court of Appeal steps that my life had been destroyed, I was offered an opportunity to work for the BBC. So I took that opportunity, and for the next 16 years, I honed my craft as an investigative journalist. I spent many years as an undercover journalist, smuggling diamonds across countries, going undercover as doorman, working in very dangerous situations, going to Afghanistan and other very difficult, hostile environments to operate in, to expose injustice or social injustices, whether it was deforestation, illegal logging in Indonesia, saving orangutans. So I spent the next 16 years as a BBC journalist. And then in 2017, I the BBC was changing, I was changing, and I needed a new start. I worked at the very top of the BBC at Panorama, the most prestigious, longest running current affairs documentary program. So I was a BBC journalist.
Hmm.
So I literally left one institution and joined another institution. And then all of a sudden I was leaving the BBC. And I was working with a production company at the time, and they approached me and said, would I be interested in hosting Inside the World's Toughest Prisons?
Uh,
And, I almost threw my shoes at them in the sense that why would I dare go back into prison having spent so many years of my life trying to get out of there? But I had a kind of grown up conversation with them about how I would want to do it. I'm not going in there to sensationalize the violence in prison. I'm not going in there to demean men who have gone through all sorts of struggles in their lives. Even though some have committed some horrendous crimes, they all have a backstory, but they also have wives, children, they also have family, and it's not right. And I've been there, I know what it's like. So having that grown up conversation and seeing how Netflix were responding to my request that if I do something like this, you've got to let me do it my way. You've got to allow me to inject my experience and personality into the show, even though it's a format. And once that was agreed, hesitantly, I agreed to do the show. And Brazil was the first episode that I did. And I didn't know what to expect. But from that moment on, going into Brazil and seeing the conditions, the violence, and everything that I experienced in that one prison made me realize that there is more to me, to the experience I went through, than just, shouting that I was a wrongfully convicted man.
mhm.
That prison should mean something to everyone. And so I've gone on this journey trying to educate people about what life is really like in prisons, not just for prisoners, but for prison guards, and the challenges that,
Mhm.
that different prisons face in different countries with different resources, different philosophies, etc.
I really appreciate that you took that opportunity. You were given a certain path in your life and you drove a certain direction, and you accumulated a certain amount of status and power in the world. And then you were approached with an idea to explore and put a spotlight on, you know, uh, yeah, I'll call it a marginalized population, right, in each society. and to try to help. And you took that opportunity. And I've appreciated watching the show. And uh, there's been a lot of times where you're having a conversation with the person who's running the prison, or a conversation with the guards about, like, hey, here's the conditions here, here's the issues that are going on here, and like, how can we reduce recidivism, reduce the amount of people coming back to prison, and actually help these guys and make it a safer place and a more humane place to be. And uh, the conversation usually is about their limitations on funding, guards, space, and how society views criminals. And as a viewer, I'm always drawn to, wow, we need to direct more of my tax dollars to the prison system and reform. Like, we need more money directed there to actually try to help people, not just lock up people for petty crimes and shove them into cells and overpopulate the prisons. So I've learned about some of the things that work and that need to change, and some of the things that don't work. Um, so yeah, thank you for and it was entertaining. You've got like gangster music at the beginning of the show, dun 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 dun, dun, which is always funny. It sort of like draws you in. It's like you're walking into prison, dun 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 dun. So yeah, thank you, man, for putting so much of your life into this. And are you not a father?
I am, yes. I have 2 children.
You have 2 children, and you're going into these prisons. Like, last night I watched the Brazil episode that's in season 2, and I'm imagining your wife protesting about you going to such dangerous places. Like, what if he gets killed in there? You're going to some of the most dangerous places. How do you balance that? I know that you don't sleep in all of the prisons because sometimes it's just not safe enough to do so. But how do you balance that level of danger for yourself, to be an investigator, but also not get yourself so deep that you end up dead?
It's an interesting question, Ben, and the fact is, I survived prison, and when I think of my children and my wife, I want I want others to survive prison. It's important that people who go to prison, survive prison, come out better people. I came out, even though I was wrongly imprisoned, I came out a better man. I came out somebody who was responsible and had something to offer. It was my internal prison experience. And so going into prisons, it is scary. I'm not playing down the fact that a lot of these places there is violence beyond the imagination. I've seen the beheading of other prisoners. I've seen and spoken to men that have committed horrendous crimes, and I just don't want to believe in myself going into these places that these individuals are scary. The situation is scary, but if you can improve the situation, you reduce the threat. And in the initial making of this series, when I did the first couple of episodes, I was taken aback by what I was experiencing in these prisons around the world, because my experience was the British prison system. And although that is horrendous in itself, these places were on a completely different level in terms of the lack of resources, the lack of humanity, etc. And I just felt that what I was doing was so important. And the reflection and reaction that I was getting from the audience that was watching it, and you've just indicated yourself your own reaction, I knew that the reason that I'm doing this is more important than just making television. It's about bringing people into a world in their own country that has been hidden from them in the same way that it is here in the United Kingdom. So going into these places is scary, but I'm not scared of the prisoners. I build a trust with the prisoners that I'm about to give them a voice that they've never had. I'm giving them an ear. I'm listening. I'm actually listening to them. Now, there are in some places psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, but they're going in there for a different reason. I'm going in there to hear these guys tell their life stories for the very first time. Now, in these shows, you only get a snippet of the stories that they share with me, but I spend hours with these guys building a trust, building a rapport, where they cry, they shake, they get angry, they go through all kinds of emotions during our discourse, that I learned so much about each and every one of these men. And I think the Brazil episode is a point in case when these guys who, I'm in a cell with a bunch of guys who only a few months earlier were chopping the heads off of other prisoners. They were carrying out barbaric acts. Barbaric acts were carried out against them. But once they learned that I myself had been in a similar situation, they were more interested in why I didn't commit suicide. You were in prison for a crime you didn't commit. Why didn't you
Mhm.
kill yourself? How did you
Mhm.
withdraw that? They saw my suffering more than they saw their own sufferings. And what that told me was that there is humanity within these men. You just need to find it, and you can find it by trying to improve their conditions. My mission, Ben, has never been to rehabilitate prisoners. I don't make this show to try and rehabilitate prisoners. I make this show to try and improve the conditions, which then give these men the chance to rehabilitate. If you
Mm.
can feed a man who's hungry, he won't be angry and desperate for food. And in many of these places, they don't have the basics like food. They don't have sanitations. They don't have running water and things like that. And I know these are conditions beyond the prison, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing what's in the prison, and I'm just arguing
Mhm.
in these shows. And I think people are getting it, that as much as they are scary, as much as they are threatening, they're only those things to me and to anybody else because of the deprivation, because of what doesn't exist.
Mhm. I saw that in the conversations that you had with guys where you go into their cell, there's 15 of them in this small cell, and you sit down on the bed with them, you listen to their stories. What's it like in here for you? How do you guys manage this? How do you get along? What are you here for? And then telling a bit of your own story, sitting on the same level as them. And when they hear your story saying, you're one of us, shaking your hand and warming to you. Yeah, there's this sort of humanity that you can see. And uh, the part of me that rises up is, yeah, like every person deserves to be able to sleep soundly, to eat fairly well, to have clean water, to be able to take care of themselves. The basics, even if we're going to lock them up because they're a danger to themselves or others, they still deserve those things. And if we give those things to them, the volatility comes down. I've seen this in addiction work as well. It's one of the principles of harm reduction. You save more lives if you just take care of some basic needs rather than just telling people to get out and fend for themselves and throwing them out on the street. So, beyond those basic needs, in the Brazil episode, another thing that I saw is where you went to a specific block, and it's a real change from the rest of the episode where everybody was just like kind of trying not to get killed um, for their whole time there. This block where guys have they're just wearing a pair of shorts, shirts off, and you're dancing. Like you guys had this sort of dance party where everybody's waving their arms and sweating, and to me it looked like Osho's dynamic meditation a little bit, and followed by this ceremony where you've got like 50 guys in a room and they're putting mud onto each other, massaging each other with mud. It's like the prison spa, and there's this like warm, affectionate vibe between guys because and guys are telling each other, hey, just relax, let me mud you, I'm going to rub you totally down with mud all the way around your eyes and all over your face. And that was a wild experience to watch. I'm sure it was a wild experience to be rubbed down by another prisoner, another guy. uh yeah, what was that like, and why do you think that kind of a thing is helpful?
I'm glad you answered the question. This ritual that I experienced was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, for the simple reason that since I was a child, apart from my father, as a male physically touching me, I'd never had that intimate contact with another man. For no other reason than it just never happened. I'd never been into a masseur, and it's been a male masseur who's massaged me. I've never needed any treatment beyond the odd injection or something from a doctor, a male doctor. So here I was, after all the years that I spent in male prisons, where I came into very little contact with men other than, tackling them on a football pitch or etc., doing weights with them. And here I was in this ritual where, as you rightly say, we had this scented mud that would normally have an hallucination sort of drug mixed into it. But for my purpose, they didn't include that. And we were jumping around, and it was this ecstatic moment that really took me out of my comfort zone, which I was really enjoying. There was a lot of testosterone going on, but at the same time, there was what I have more than anything, which is an empathy, a sympathy and an empathy with other guys. Now, I was partnered with this guy who I knew nothing about, and that's key. I partnered with this guy I knew nothing about. He and I were laughing and we were giggling. And as you say, the tension of trying to survive in the other part of the prison had almost lifted off my shoulders. And that was the purpose of this spiritual sort of part of the prison. And then he was rubbing mud from my neck. I was in my boxer shorts and he was rubbing mud on my face, down my neck. And that in itself was a really weird experience, having this guy touch me and rub all down me, apart from my private parts. And then I did the same to him, which again was another bizarre thing, but I really enjoyed it. It also broke down barriers for me to be doing
Yeah.
something I'd never done before, and not be, physically touching someone in that way. I'm always assuming that you get sexually aroused, and that's what it wasn't anything to do with any of that.
Mm-hmm.
But then I found out that my partner had been and was in prison for rape and murder. And then there was this moment where I froze, because I then looked at him, I looked at his hands, and I thought, those hands that you've just used to cover my body in this scented mud had committed the heinous crime of rape. And I couldn't get it out of my head. It just made me feel slightly uncomfortable, only for a short period, because I was then swept up in the whole ritual and tried to forget that moment. But it was a mark. It was a mark for me, as it should be for everybody, that even in those situations, there's nothing wrong with your human instincts. And my instinct at that point was disgust. I felt uncomfortable because I didn't like the fact that this guy had committed such an horrendous act against a defenseless women or women.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the whole experience, for different reasons, was very enlightening. But just going back to the other point you made, and that is sitting in that cell with the more dangerous elements of the prison, I genuinely am empathetic. One, because I have been one of those guys. As you say, when I sat there and had conversations and they embraced me as one of them, I was once upon a time one of them. And there was always an outsider trying to get in, but they didn't understand. They didn't have the empathy or the sympathy, because they hadn't been through the same experience. They didn't know what it, or don't always know what it's like to feel that inner suffering. They don't know what it's like to not be able to open a door for yourself, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So when I'm talking to these guys, deep down inside me, I remember what it was like for myself. So I appreciate and have much more empathy for what it's like for them. But you're absolutely right. That ritual was one of the most bizarre, but one of the most exciting things I've ever done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really grateful to that was captured on film, and uh, I've been steeped in the personal growth world since I was a teenager. Since I went to rehab, actually, I went to rehab when I was 16, and there's a lot of different things that help a person change and help them, let go of old ways of being and step into new ways of being. And at some of these seminars that I've been to, where you go for the weekend or you go for 5 days, there are these ecstatic experiences that they get people to do to sort of lift up their spirits and help them connect to each other, and also connect to themselves at a deeper level. And those things, they produce sometimes a lasting change in a person, a fundamental change in how a person sees the world. And the contrast that I saw there in that experience, where on one side, you've got guys who see the world as a dangerous place that doesn't care about them. It's cold and you could get killed at any moment. It's not safe, versus this situation where safety is present. There is safety among men, and it's safe to open up. It's safe to touch each other. It's safe to be touched, to express your emotions, to just talk to each other openly, to look into each other's eyes, right? Without it meaning that you want to fight, or that there's trouble coming around the corner. That, from my understanding, is like, that's the therapeutic context. And when you introduce that into a system, you actually do start to see recidivism, or healing, so to speak. Um, and it's that high, it's that next tier up in Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like, if we could take care of uh, basic sleeping, basic food, basic water, what about the needs for human connection? The need to be seen as you are and accepted for who you are, and to also give and be of service to others. That's happening in that scenario. And arguably, it's not that expensive either to do something like that when you're running an institution, because you're really just getting people into a room together and facilitating some exercises to help them connect. But the power of that is, in my world, cannot be overstated.
I I I totally agree with you, Ben, and I found that ritual experience. I'm a man who lost a lot of trust, lost a lot of love because of the suffering that I personally went through. And even though I'd been out of prison for a number of years, I've not been through or had any kind of therapy. So that I've had some therapy, but I've never addressed the suffering or that inner anger. The day I walked out of prison after 12 years, I was able to embrace one of my sisters and cry for the very first time. And it was at that very moment that I was released that I embraced my sister and shed a tear, or tears. In fact, couldn't stop crying for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
That's when my bitter anger and everything else that I'd been carrying in prison left my body. It was
Mm-hmm.
so cathartic. It almost disappeared at that very moment. And that's why I was able to go on, be successful, where many guys who've been in my situation go on to become drug addicts or alcoholic, alcoholism. And for me, it was very different. But even so, when I went into that Brazilian prison and went through that ritual, that in itself was a bit of therapy for me. But I totally agree with you. In all the prisons that I've been in, there is very few exercises where guys, share experiences in a way that can make them think differently. There are in some prisons drug therapy units or some other kind of counseling units. And wherever I've seen that, there is a personality change in those individual men that are hardened criminals who are now embracing other men because they're not fearful of men coming into their space. I still harbor a little bit of that. I do harbor because of the toughness I had to endure and become when I was in prison. I've not had the privilege that a lot of these prisoners have had of going through these therapeutic sessions where, as you say, you go through these exercises and you become a different person. I have not seen enough of that in prison. And I think you're absolutely right. By introducing more of this in prisons, once you've dealt with some of the basic needs or alongside some of the basic needs, you can reach men in a way no rehabilitation program can.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk with you about, just to get some of the basic facts of how you see things out there for people to hear. What doesn't work in the prison system? What are the elements that don't work when you're trying to um, care for the criminals in your society, and what does work? What doesn't work? What does work?
I don't think there's a one hat fits all, but in my experience, punishment, and by punishment I mean physical punishment or the deprivation of senses, i.e., putting someone in a cell in darkness, putting someone in a cell on their own for weeks, if not months at a time, that does not work. What you are creating is something or someone who is damaged. They're already damaged being in prison. It may be that one of the reasons they're being put into the punishment block is because they already have some kind of mental health issue, drug addiction, or some other problem that the prison have not identified, and they go on to punish that individual. But overall punishment is being sent to prison. Continuously punishing someone in prison does not work, in my experience. I also think that what can work is having empathy and understanding, not judging, and trying to address the needs of individuals. And by that I mean not trying to think that all burglars have the same problems, because they don't. They come from different environments. You've got to treat prisoners with humanity. I've witnessed this in one or two prisons that I've been in, and treating prisoners with humanity makes them realize that somebody cares, that their whole life where they've been abused or they've been in a situation where they've had to fight or flight, that there are people that do care about them. And I think just listening and understanding what somebody needs, that's not me saying you give them what they need, but I do believe if you understand what somebody's problem is, the problem that drives their criminality, if you like, or the problem that they need to address, that works. What people don't always understand is that most prisoners have made a mistake, done something wrong. Not all prisoners are recidivism, where they go in and out, go in and out. It may be that those that do have a drug addiction. So they're going out clean, but they soon get back on the drugs, and then they need to support their drug habit, and they go and do something, can get caught and end up back in prison, get clean again, and then get out. What they need is the support, and they don't get the support. And it's really a difficult one to argue, because when you compare that to the needs of people that have never been in trouble with the law or have never been to prison, people will often sort of say, well, they're more deserving than that person. And we have to change that narrative. We have to change the mindset. So for me, what works is changing the mindset of the public so that they can put pressure on the politicians who have the power to influence what happens in prisons.
Oh, yeah. Well said, man. If I could summarize the first bit that you said about what doesn't work, it's don't hurt people further. Don't make the problem worse, right? Don't keep hurting the hurting person, right? Don't harm them further. And really focus on helping the person. And I think that's the perspective that gets lost when as a society we're mad at people for causing harm here or there, or breaking the laws, or making us feel unsafe. That reaction, we want to slap and lock away and punish a person for eternity. It just makes the problem worse. And when you look at this stuff on a higher level financially, it doesn't work very well. You create lifetime criminals that then your society has to pay for taking care of, rather than making an investment in their healing early on, and then they become a person who contributes, quote, to the economy, and is back in the system and is creating good things. I had the privilege of seeing, when I went through rehab, how many people, all these people in there, were hurting badly. They all had trauma. They all grew up with some, for some people it was, a really rough living situation growing up. For other people it was, they got taken away or they were raped. And the things that they had done. I remember sitting in circle with people, listening to the regret that they had done certain things. Most people, 99% of people, have a conscience, and they go against that conscience for whatever reason. Everybody listening to this has gone against their own conscience, right? And the people that I was sitting in circle with aren't that different. They had just gone to some extremes, and they had ended up sitting in this seat with me. And watching those people heal by sitting in circle, by sharing, and by being led by a group of their peers and shown the way, how to live sober, how to find a set of principles to live by, how to help yourself feel safe in the world, right? How to ask for help from the right people so that you do feel supported. There was, I guess what I'm saying is, like, I know people who have done heinous things as well, and they have the capacity to be good people, and they need people who can see that in them to guide them there. Because if we don't, they will stay there. They will stay in those dark places, and then we will have to continue to lock them up, until it's over for them. But there will just be a continuous cycle. So there needs to be a perspective shift on seeing the humanity in everyone, no matter how they behave. And for me, what I've realized is that there's always going to be a percentage of the population that is suffering in some capacity, or that is traumatized or mentally ill. I have my oldest brother is schizophrenic, and for me, he's beyond help. I don't know how to help him. He's got there is a chemistry there that causes him to behave erratically and be paranoid, and me and my society don't know how to help him. He's just out there bouncing around, and ends up homeless, and then ends up in jail, and then homeless again. And there is a percentage of the population that is always going to be suffering in that way, and we have to decide how we're going to deal with those people, no matter what their behavior is. What are we going to do with those people? Are we just going to trash them, or are we going to take care of them and do our best to try to help them? And I feel like that decision is indicative of how evolved we are as a society, where we're willing to place our effort.
It's so good that you shared that story, Ben, especially about your brother, because what that indicates, and it's something that I'm always trying to do, is sort of saying, you know, this person in prison has a brother like you, Ben. You're your brother's brother, and he ends up in prison. And although, admittedly, there is nothing you can do to 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 stop that condition, what you can do, what I can do, what society can do is support your brother. We can support your brother by making the conditions where he ends up in prison more comfortable, not in a let's give him a nice bed and a television, but let's allow him to wash his face. Let's allow him to keep his health by having healthy food. Let's do the things in the prison that can support your brother and the many millions like your brother who, through no fault of their own, because of an imbalance in their DNA or their health, end up going to prison, or out of desperation for trying to feed their children or whatever. So that's what the majority of people who end up in prison are coming from: mental health issues, or they have, economical problems, whatever it is. And all I'm trying to do in my program is help people like your brother. And I'm trying to get people outside to understand that people who end up in prison are not all bad. That's one of the reasons that when I shot 5 or 6 of my Netflix programs, I kept leaving the prisons feeling really, really kind of down about the fact that I've just made a program with these guys. They've shared their story. I've got empathy, but the conditions are appalling. They're not being fed. I've contributed to that in some way. What can I do? And I set up a foundation not to help the prisoners that people turn around and say to me, well, why would you want to help prisoners? It's not about the prisoners. It's about providing the support network so that they don't become prisoners, or those prisoners that are prisoners come out and they have further support. So by setting up a foundation that will help provide the food, that will help the infrastructure or the resources, or providing the educational training or the therapists that need to go in to address schizophrenia in prisons where they don't have therapists. If I can help facilitate that, it can make a huge difference, not only to people like your brother, but to you, because then you feel that your brother's getting support when he's in that environment, and that's a burden lifted from you. Now, we're not talking about tens of billions of people here. We're talking about, thousands of prisoners in different countries, and we should be able to provide that support. And that's one of my drivers, really is.
It's a compassionate approach that you're talking about. And I think that's the real difference. If I could sum it up when I look at it, when you treat people like they're bad and they enter a prison where there's an us versus them, from the guards to the prisoners, and they feel like scum, they feel like shit, that lowers their consciousness, brings brings stress into the system, and it doesn't create an opportunity for healing. And in each season, I noticed that you covered a prison that was more compassionate. There was one in Germany, the therapy prison. I believe there was one in Greenland. And in these places, the guards treat the prisoners with a level of respect. In some places, they gave them the keys to their own rooms. There was one that had a store, like a store that you could just sort of walk into and grab whatever you wanted, and you just check out with it. And where guys had jobs in the prison, and responsibility, and therapy, and where the guards would sit on the couch and talk with the other prisoners. And that warmed my heart, because you could see the change in the prisoners, and how they were learning to trust people, to trust themselves, to open up. And there was this sort of brighter consciousness that you could see in them, because they were being given compassion in that environment. And so that's the essence I've taken from your show, is like, yeah, that's our North Star, that level of compassion.
What's really interesting about the point you make there is there are two things going on from what I've witnessed. One is the training of prison staff. If the prison staff are trained in a way where they can deal with the issues of prisoners, but also build a friendship. When I walked into that Norwegian prison and the prison guard offered me his hand to shake, he's a guard, I'm a prisoner. And in the many prisons that I'd been in, there was always confrontation. But that disarmed me, as I said in the program. The simple fact that he gestured his hand to sort of say, I'm not going to treat you like a prisoner. I'm going to treat you like a man, a human being. He shook my hand. That disarmed me, and it made me realize that he's not the enemy almost instantly. If they could do that in all prisons, I know it's not possible. So the first thing is about training. And what they do in the Norwegian prison, in the Greenland prison, is they train their prison officers to treat their inmates like human beings, to recognize that they have issues and problems and try and identify those problems. The second thing leads on from that. Once they've identified those problems, they can then provide the level of education or training to help that individual develop a skill or a level of academia, so that what happens next when they get out of prison, they have a skill, or they are educated, or they have a desire to do something more with their lives than go on to commit raw crimes. Hence the reason that these places have the lowest recidivism rates, i.e. the lowest reoffending rates, i.e. prisoners don't come out and go on to commit more crimes, because one, the prison guards have become not their friends, but their trainers, and they've been given the opportunity with the resources, and not all prisons have the resources to provide workshops to train people to become painters and decorators or mechanics. But where they do have those resources and those facilities, they are successful. And the key to it, Ben, is this: when those prisoners, who the prison guards get to know, train and educate, come out of prison, the next victim is avoided. whether it's the shopkeeper who loses a few loaves of bread, or it's the woman who faces the threat of rape, or someone else who's held at knife point, etc., etc. That's what it's all about, isn't it? We all want to avoid victims as much as we possibly can. So if they do the right thing in prison, then that's where it leads to less victims. And that's what it's all about in my eyes.
100%. What I was picturing as you were talking was this sort of reparenting process. I think that can come through when you've got guards who have the capacity to be tough. They've got good boundaries, and they're compassionate, and they're willing to sit down with you and take the time and listen and guide you towards a new way of living. This is reparenting. And I mean, it takes a lot to guide and train a guard to operate in that way in a prison, right? And to set their boundaries accordingly. It must be a very skillful process to do so. But yeah, there's like this reparenting that occurs. And I notice that too in my work, in men's work, is, every man has wounds with the masculine, wounds with the father, with the structures of the world. So there's like the father in your home, but then there's like the masculine that was around you in your childhood, and then there's like the masculine structures of your society. We all have wounds at each of those levels. And how do you heal that? You have to do that in real time as an adult with new systems, with new ways of being. And this is what we're doing in men's work when we sit in circle and we challenge each other with love and we hold boundaries with each other. We hold each other accountable. There's this reparenting that's occurring. We're giving each other the masculine toughness paired with support and love and compassion that we needed as a child and perhaps didn't get in certain places. And when we get that, we step into our fullness as a man. So I saw those pieces moving in those prisons in Norway and in Germany. So yeah, again, thank you for going there and for taking that lens as well, and yeah, for going deeper. It's not just entertainment value. There's a real story you're weaving here and a real purpose I can tell to the work that you're doing, and trying to change the world.
I wish it was that simple. The flip side of it all, Ben, and I'm sure you experience this in your men's circles, is there is resistance. When people go to prison, we often talk about, and I don't like to talk about rehabilitation because that encapsulates a lot of different things. But in essence, rehabilitation suggests that when you get someone in a prison, you should be able to turn them around. And the systems around the world, the prison systems around the world, fail miserably. They spend billions of pounds in this country alone, but in countries all over the world, the American incarceration rate is just skyrocketingly, ridiculously, and it's disproportionately, and there's big issues there. But the key that people want to believe is that when people go into prison, regardless of their crimes, that they are rehabilitated. What they fail to realize, and what we don't tell people enough, and I suspect that this is something you experience in the work that you do, is the resistance that you get from some prisoners, because only when those prisoners are ready to change will they embrace that rehabilitation. No person can make somebody give up crime. That person has to want to give up crime. That person has to want to change. And that's what I try to identify within the individuals that I meet and within the prisons that I go to. What is it that you can do that really does make that individual want to change? And I repeat, it's when they offer them these opportunities like new training. I've never learned to become a mechanic, not me, but that prisoner. Now he's learned how to become a mechanic. It gives him a better chance of getting out and getting a job, etc., etc., etc. But the key is the individual has got to want to change. You will know that better than most as a former addict. Only when you were ready to give up drugs and fight yourself and resist the drugs did you change and then go on to help other people change. And that's what's key.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you, Raphael. Do you still have your podcast?
I do still have my podcast, and obviously that second chance. Everything I do, Ben,
Mm-hmm.
is driven by my desperate need to try and educate people about, does somebody deserve a second chance? Hence the title of my
Mm-hmm.
podcast, Second Chance. Do you have a reason to give someone a second chance? Should they be given a second chance? Do you take your second chance? What is a second chance? And that drives the conversations on my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just love people coming on and talking about what they think second chance actually means in their lives, but for others.
Uh-huh. And you wrote a book.
I did. Notorious. It was a long time coming, actually, and I think it was actually driven by public demand. As a result of my work in Netflix, people wanted to know more about who I was, and they kept asking me some very personal questions. The more popular you become, I suppose people are more interested in who you are, what you do, where you come from, what blah blah. And
Mm-hmm.
so I felt it was one way of answering a lot of those questions inside a book. It was a really difficult one because I'm a very private person, despite the fact that I have a public um, a job in the public arena, being on Netflix. I think my work does expose me to the public. So that's why I wrote the book, to try and tell people a little bit more about who I am, what I do, and why I do what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, I set up the foundation as well. It was driven by the work I do on Netflix. I didn't have a thought about doing anything like that, despite my own experience. But having seen what I've seen in prisons, I want to give something back. I'm
Mm-hmm.
entertaining the millions of people around the world who watch Netflix. And now I'm saying to them, well, if you really want to do something about what you've seen, help me. Help me in my foundation. Go back into some of these places and feed the prisoners. And I'll give you
Mm-hmm.
one example just to sort of round that off. When I was in Papua New Guinea, I was given the job of working in the kitchen, and I helped cook some rice, and that's their staple diet. They get rice and sardines throughout the day. It's such a poor prison. And I'm in there scooping up rice, giving these guys, and the guys are saying to me, "You're giving them too much, you're giving them too much." By the time I got to the end of the barrel, there were still about 30 or 40 guys in the queue waiting for rice. And I turned to the guy and said, "Where's the next pot?" And he said to me, "The rice is finished." And I looked at the guys and their sad faces. And I'm not making judgment because I don't know what any of them are committed, what crimes. They were just standing in a queue expecting to get their scoop of rice. And there was no rice left, Ben, for me to give these guys. And when the guy said there was no more, I said, "Well, what do they get?" And he said, "They won't eat." And instead of these guys breaking out into a riot, they just humbly turned around and walked away and were going to wait till the next meal. Now, surely we can do something about that. We can go in there. I'm not saying we buy bags of rice and we go in there, but what we do is we give them the skills to grow their own vegetables. We can
Mm-hmm.
put seeds in the ground so they can grow potatoes so that they can feed themselves and other prisoners and maybe the outside population because they have the facilities. Why are they not using it? And when I see things like that, it baffles me that we can't do anything about it. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we can. And that's why I set up my foundation.
What's the foundation called?
The Raphael Rowe Foundation. It's as simple
Yeah.
as that. Raphael Rowe Foundation, because I think my name in it drives me to make it become what I want it to become. I want
Uh-huh.
it to serve that sustainable purpose. It's not about going in there giving them the rice. It's about helping them to sustain their existence. And I will do
Beautiful.
that in as many places as I possibly can.
Beautiful, man. You're in legacy building phase of your life, and you're building a legacy. You're bringing compassion uh, to people all over the world. So thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for being vulnerable. For I've never seen a person be strip searched so many times on TV. Like, I mean, yeah, for such a private guy, you put yourself through a lot on this show, man. And I always really appreciate people who put themselves out there so much and just jump into the fire, and that's what you do. Uh, what's coming up for Raphael Rowe?
Well, I can share with you that there is going to be more of the Netflix series because I'm not done yet. I think there is still a bigger message to deliver to the audience in other countries. I want people to see what's being done in their name, what their tax dollars are being spent on. So Netflix are consistently wanting more of these shows. I don't know how many more times I can go through the strip searches, but it serves a purpose. It reminds people of the ordeal that people go through, and they wish it wasn't them, and it's not them, it's me. And trust me, I don't, every time I do it, I feel, intimidated. I lose my identity. I go through the similar experiences I went through in real life. And I want people to know, just finally, about the Netflix show is that it is all real. There's no get up. I don't have any security. I don't have anybody standing behind me saying, cut, and doing the stuff that you see in dramas. It's all as you see it. As I walk into that cell, I'm walking in there for the first time. So however those prisoners respond to me, I have to deal with it. And there have been occasions where I've tried to run, but then realize, where do you go? And that is
Yeah.
genuine, and that is genuine fear, etc. But I'm still doing the Netflix show. I've got my podcast. I've written my book. I've just released an Audible original investigation into a miscarriage of justice, something
Hmm.
I've not really done before. I've only looked at a couple of those. So I'm plodding away, Ben, just doing what I think educates people about things that they're unaware of, or if they are aware of it, I'm trying to give them a little bit more of an insight using my own experience. And I do it genuinely because I believe in it. I get
Hmm.
emotionally connected to whatever it is that I'm doing. And if I can't feel the emotional connection, if I can't feel the compassion and the empathy, and it's not just about injustice, it can be about any particular issue, I can't do it because it doesn't feel right. I
Hmm.
prefer someone else who has that insight and that experience. So everything I do in my line of work as a journalist, and everything that I do in my life, is driven by my emotions, and it comes from where we started this conversation, and that is sitting in a space on my own where I learn so much about myself. I discovered who I was, and I want people to discover who they are.
The wound becomes the gift, right? And you have taken that and turned it into gold. Thank you, man. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for coming on the Evolving Man Show. And yeah, this was a great conversation, man. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
All right, man. We'll put the links in the show notes. Everybody can find your foundation and your social media channels. We'll get it all in the show notes. Thanks, folks, for listening. Please share this episode if you liked it. All the best.